Here is what happened at 6:40 in the morning on June the 2nd, 2022, at a foundry outside Peoria, Illinois. A 39-year-old melting specialist named Steven Dierkes leaned over an 11-foot pot of iron, heated past 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, to pull a routine sample. It was his 9th day on the job. He never got a 10th. This is the corporation that built the machines which raised the Hoover Dam, cut roads through jungle no wheel could cross, and helped win 2 world wars. It has also never stopped putting men within 4 feet of open molten iron. A number that comes directly from a federal investigation, and by the end of this film you'll know exactly what it means. The tractor came first. Riveted steel, tracked instead of wheeled, strong enough to pull a cannon out of French mud. Nearly 19,000 of one single model were built by hand, by men standing over crucibles of white-hot iron. That fire never went out. It is burning right now, inside a company that still carries the name a photographer gave a crawling machine more than 100 years ago. So here is the question this film is built to answer. A company worth tens of billions of dollars, staffed by engineers who understand precisely what liquid iron does to a human body. Why does it still let men work 4 feet from the edge? The number nobody wants to say out loud. Before we get into how this company was built, you need 4 facts. Hold on to all 4, because this film is going to keep coming back to them. First, in the last 3 years, 3 different men have died inside the same foundry building, southwest of Peoria, on what locals call Route 24. A fall through an open floor, a fall into fire, a spill of molten metal that caught a 3rd man where he stood. 3 different mechanisms of death. 1 building, 1 owner. Second, the temperature that makes all 3 deaths possible. Molten iron, in these foundries, runs past 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Some accounts put a specific pour closer to 2,600. Steel itself melts around 2,500. Human skin does not survive contact with either for even half a second. A body that falls into iron at that temperature doesn't burn the way film and television usually show it. It stops existing as a recognizable shape within moments. A coroner in Peoria County had a clinical phrase for what that does to a person. It wasn't burn. It was closer to erasure. Third, the distance. 4 feet. That's how close federal investigators found workers were routinely required to stand from the open, unguarded edge of an 11-foot pit of that same molten iron. No rail, no restraint system, nothing between a person and the drop except a painted line on the floor and a company sign a few yards away that reads, without any apparent irony, "Safety is in your hands." Fourth, the fine. $145,027. That's what a federal agency proposed the company pay after the first of these deaths, once investigators found the exact missing hardware that should have been there and wasn't. Hold that number. This film is going to show you precisely how many seconds of company income it represents, and the answer is smaller than you're expecting. Now here's the context that makes all 4 facts matter. This isn't a small operation. The foundry we're describing melts as much as 500 tons of iron in a single day and more than 150,000 tons across a year, using roughly 800 employees working multiple shifts. It is one of the largest of its kind in the country, owned by a corporation that made more money last year than the economies of several small nations combined. Foundry work ranks, in federal survey after federal survey, among the most hazardous jobs in American manufacturing. Heat stress, molten metal burns, respiratory exposure, and crushing injuries, sometimes in the same 8-hour shift. Caterpillar didn't invent that danger, and no single company did. But scale changes the math. A small foundry with 1 furnace and a dozen workers is a different kind of risk than an industrial-scale operation pouring iron by the hundreds of tons every day for a company with the resources to engineer that risk down to almost nothing, if it decided that was worth the cost. One more number, held for later without explanation, 18,948. Keep it in mind. We'll come back to it and to a 4th name you don't know yet. Justin Perry. and to a nearly century-old construction project that has more in common with a 21st century foundry than you'd expect. None of this is new to this company. Go back far enough, and the record of daily danger gets thinner, not because the danger was smaller, but because almost nobody was writing it down. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the agency that investigated the deaths this film is going to walk you through, didn't exist until 1971. For the company's first 46 years, no federal agency had the legal authority to walk onto a foundry floor and inspect it at all. That doesn't excuse what happened later. It explains how long this particular problem has had room to hide. Because the real question was never how these men died. Machines have been able to kill a person instantly for as long as there have been machines. That part of industrial history stopped being a mystery a long time ago. The real question is why a company old enough and profitable enough to have solved this problem decades ago has instead spent those decades finding new language to describe the same hole in the floor. That question has an answer, and it starts in the 1800s with two California families who came to despise each other long before either one built a tractor. Two rivals who ended up sharing a name they never wanted. To understand how Caterpillar was built, you first have to understand that it was built by two men who spent 35 years trying to put each other out of business. Daniel Best ran a company in San Leandro, California, making steam-powered grain cleaners and combine harvesters. Across the Delta in Stockton, the Holt brothers ran a nearly identical business, chasing the same customers and competing over the same mud-choked farmland where an ordinary wheel just sank in and stayed. In 1908, worn down by the competition, Best sold his company outright to Holt Manufacturing. On paper, that should have ended the rivalry. It didn't. Best's own son, Clarence Leo Best, had spent 2 years working inside the very company that had absorbed his father's business. Then he walked out and built a new one from nothing, the CL, Best Gas Traction Company, designed for a single purpose: to beat the men who had beaten his father. Both companies were chasing the same engineering problem. How do you build a tractor heavy enough to do real work without it sinking into soft ground? Benjamin Holt tested his answer outside Stockton in 1904. A machine that moved on continuous tracks instead of wheels, spreading its weight across a much larger footprint. A photographer watching the test said it moved like a caterpillar. Holt liked the word enough to trademark it immediately. Best, locked out of that name by his rival's own paperwork, called his machines track layers instead. A different label for the same underlying idea, developed by two branches of one broken family flying two separate flags. That naming fight wasn't trivial. In an industry where farmers were choosing between competing brands they'd rarely seen in person, a memorable name mattered almost as much as horsepower. And Holt had gotten there first. By 1909, Holt needed more manufacturing space than California could give him. A Peoria farm equipment dealer named Murray Baker had heard that a bankrupt local manufacturer, the Collian Manufacturing Company, had a modern, fully equipped plant sitting empty in a town called East Peoria, Illinois. Baker tipped off the Holts, and they bought the whole operation for a fraction of what it had cost to build. On February 16th, 1910, the first tractor rolled off that Illinois line. 12 employees running Collian's second-hand machinery under a freshly painted company name. Within a year, that same plant employed 625 people. It has never stopped running since, and it is not, as you'll see, the same building where this century's deaths happened. A distinction worth holding on to for later. Then came the war. Holt's tracked tractors could haul heavy artillery through mud that swallowed horses and wheeled trucks whole. The British and French armies bought them by the thousand, and the machine's grinding, track-laying silhouette became the visual template for an entirely new weapon, the tank. By the war's end, the original Stockton plant alone had grown from 300 employees in 1909 to roughly 2,500, building more than 4,000 of Holt's largest tractor. Some 1,800 of them purchased directly by the military. In April of 1918, a British general named Ernest Swinton, one of the men credited with inventing the tank in the first place, traveled to Stockton in person to thank Holt's workers for what their machine had made possible. That was the peak. It was also, almost immediately, the setup for a collapse. The war that had made Holt manufacturing rich ended, and it took the market with it. Military orders that had run the factories at full capacity for 4 years vanished within months, leaving the company holding an enormous surplus of heavy tractors nobody on a peacetime farm needed. Benjamin Holt died in 1920, and the bankers holding the company's debt didn't trust his successors to fix what came next. They installed their own man on the board, a former Boston banker named Thomas Baxter, to run a company Holt himself had spent 30 years building. C.L. Best's company, meanwhile, had spent the war years developing the domestic tractor market Holt had largely ignored, and came out the other side with a healthier balance sheet, a stronger dealer network, and this is the part that matters: no debt anyone outside the company controlled. By 1925, the arithmetic was straightforward, even if the announcement wasn't. Holt had the name, the reputation, and the largest factories on 2 coasts. Best had the money and the leverage. In April of that year, the 2 rival companies, one family's business, split apart a generation earlier and rebuilt as 2 firms that had spent 35 years trying to bury each other, merged into a single entity, taking its permanent name from a nickname a photographer had coined 21 years before, Caterpillar Tractor Company. It's described, in company histories then and now, as a merger of equals. Read the underlying finances, and it looks more like a rescue. One company's debt quietly absorbed into a deal dressed up as a partnership, because the alternative for Holt Manufacturing may well have been bankruptcy. There's one more detail worth knowing before we move on, because it tells you something about how this company remembers its own history. When the merger closed, C.L. Best, the son who had built a rival firm purely out of ambition and grievance, became the new company's first chairman of the board. That title was largely ceremonial. Day-to-day control went to Raymond Force, a company attorney who became the new firm's president and chief executive, which tells you where the real authority actually sat. Benjamin Holt, the man whose nickname for a crawling machine had given the merged company its name, had already been dead for 5 years. He never lived to see the word Caterpillar painted on anything bigger than his own factory gate. The old Cullion plant in East Peoria, the one Murray Baker had found for a fraction of its value, became the new company's largest manufacturing center. It's still there. But the specific foundry where this century's deaths took place isn't that building, and it isn't from that era. Understanding what it actually is, and when it was actually built, is where the mechanics of this story begin. The machine that shouldn't have worked, and the fire that makes it. Start with the machine, because understanding it is the fastest way to understand everything that came after. On June 24, 1919, C.L. Best introduced his masterpiece, the Best 60 track layer, a 20,500-pound crawler powered by a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that could pull 12,000 pounds through mud that would swallow a wheeled truck to its axles. Here's why that mattered mechanically. A standard mid-size tracked machine like the 60 spreads its weight across roughly 5 to 10 pounds of pressure per square inch of ground, in the same range as an ordinary person standing in shoes. That's the entire trick behind the design. Wheels concentrate weight into a small contact patch and sink. Tracks spread that same weight over a much larger footprint and float. The same principle keeps a person from sinking into snow while wearing snowshoes, just scaled up to 20,000 pounds of steel. After the 1925 merger, the Best 60 was renamed the Caterpillar 60, and it became the machine that defined the company for the next decade. Between 1919 and 1931, factories in San Leandro and Peoria built 18,948 of them. That's the number from Chapter 1. Over 13,000 of those in Illinois alone, each one assembled largely by hand at a price of $6,000. Set that price against an average American manufacturing wage of roughly $1,200 a year in the 1920s, And a foundryman pouring the iron for one of those engine blocks would have needed 5 full years of wages, spent on nothing else, to buy the machine he was helping build. The 60 went to work on every continent except Antarctica. It cleared mahogany out of West African forest and cut roads through Chinese farmland. It dug canals in Europe and hauled rubber out of South American plantations that had never seen a wheeled vehicle survive the wet season. Later machines carrying the same name and the same basic engineering helped raise Hoover Dam 700 feet above the Colorado River, helped grade the approach roads to the Golden Gate Bridge, and even helped clear the hillside for the sign that would eventually read Hollywood. When the Second World War came, Caterpillar built engines for landing craft, generators for forward air bases, and thousands of crawler tractors that cleared invasion beaches and cut the airstrips behind them. When that war ended, its dozers helped lay more than 70,000 miles of American highway. There's an honest case that no single manufacturer did more to physically build the 20th century than this one. 1931 was the last year Caterpillar built a gas engine, 60. It was also the first year the company sold a diesel tractor of its own design. And, several hundred miles away, the same year a state mine inspector formally warned a dam contractor that gasoline-powered machines were poisoning men working underground in tunnels choked with exhaust. That warning went nowhere. That story is coming, and it matters more than it sounds like it should right now. None of the 20th century's accomplishments existed without a hole in the ground and a fire hot enough to turn rock into liquid. Here's the part that doesn't make the visitor's center brochure: the basic process for casting an iron engine block. Inside every Caterpillar engine, then and now, has barely changed since the company's earliest decades. Iron ore, coke or scrap, and additives go into a furnace, which runs somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn solid metal the color of the sun. An experienced worker can read that temperature by color alone, before checking any gauge. A dull cherry red near 1,000 degrees, climbing through orange, then a blinding, shadowless white above 2,000. At that color, iron pours almost like water and looks, for a fraction of a second, harmless. That's exactly what makes it dangerous to anyone who hasn't spent years learning to read it. Once the iron is molten, it's tapped into a holding vessel. Sometimes a smaller crucible, sometimes a much larger ladle. At Caterpillar's largest foundry, that ladle looks something like an oversized teapot and can hold up to 48,000 pounds of iron at roughly 2,500 degrees. A crew of 3, in full fire-resistant protective gear, checks the temperature and chemistry before a crane operator lifts and carries that ladle to the molds. From there, the metal is poured into shapes packed from sand, cooled, broken out, cleaned, and sent off to be machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Everything after the pour is precision work. The pour itself is still, at its core, a person moving liquid rock from one container to another and trusting gravity, ceramic, and their own footing to cooperate at the same moment. Modern foundries have replaced the old coke-fired cupola furnace with electric induction and arc furnaces, which are cleaner and easier to control. Here's the mechanism, because it's worth understanding. An induction furnace wraps a water-cooled copper coil around a lined crucible, and an alternating electrical current through that coil generates a magnetic field strong enough to induce its own currents directly inside the metal charge. Those induced currents are what generate the heat. The furnace effectively uses the iron itself as the heating element, rather than burning fuel underneath it. It's faster to control and far cleaner to run than a coke-fired cupola. It produces the exact same end result: several tons of liquid metal that a person still has to stand near to manage. They've automated much of the transport between stations. They have not automated the moment a person has to stand near the vessel itself to sample it, check it, or guide the pour. And that's the design choice, or the design failure, this entire film is circling. Here's the fact that reframes everything else in this chapter. The specific foundry where 3 of this story's 4 deaths took place is a dedicated facility in the town of Mapleton, roughly a dozen miles from the original 1910 plant, and its current building didn't cast its first iron until 1978. that matters. This is a purpose-built, modern industrial facility constructed within living memory, younger than the interstate highway system. And it still runs the same 4-foot gap between a walking surface and an 11-foot drop of liquid iron that a foundryman faced back in 1925. The tractors got faster. The engines got cleaner. The company got richer than its founders could have imagined. North of $60 billion in revenue in a recent year, more than the gross domestic product of dozens of small countries. The furnace technology improved. The metallurgy became precise enough to cast parts for machines that will dig on tomorrow's job sites. The 4 feet did not get any farther away. Building BB, the sledgehammer, and the ladder nobody fixed. To understand what this job actually asks of a person, you need more than the temperature chart and the tonnage figures from the last chapter. You need to know what an ordinary shift feels like, and what the people who've worked one will tell you if you ask them directly. Steven Dierkes, the man from this film's opening minute, had spent most of his adult life in manufacturing. He trained at the Illinois Welding School, built a career with his hands, and took a job at the Mapleton Foundry in the spring of 2022. Steady, blue-collar work of the kind that built the town around it. Hold him in mind as this chapter unfolds, because this film is going to make you wait a little longer before it tells you what happens to him. Ask people who've worked that building what a normal day feels like, and the word that comes up most often is heat. Foundry floors run hot enough that workers strip down to the minimum protective gear the job allows and still sweat through it within the first 2 hours. Layer on the noise, the roar of the furnace, the clang of ladles, the grind of overhead cranes carrying loads that could crush a person without slowing down to register it happened. One former Caterpillar employee, who spent 3 years in the company's East Peoria complex, wrote afterward about a colleague transferred over from Mapleton, whose job was standing beside another man, both of them pounding on a casting with sledgehammers when a heavy hook came loose from an overhead gantry crane and dropped without warning, missing his coworker by a matter of feet. That colleague, he said, was terrified, not just on the day it happened, but every shift after, working under the same crane. That worker's account wasn't unusual. People who've worked at or with the Mapleton plant describe it independently of one another, using the same 2 words, a death trap. Workers at unionized Caterpillar sites do have a formal channel for raising exactly these kinds of concerns. A joint labor management safety committee written into the union contract. More than one worker who spoke up after a recent death described that channel as one that absorbed complaints more often than it acted on them. When Daulton Simmers died in 2024, a death this film returns to shortly, the local union representing Mapleton workers issued no public statement at all. There's a moment worth sitting inside for a second, so the mechanics of this job are clear rather than abstract. Picture 2 in the morning on an ordinary Tuesday shift. The furnace roar is a physical pressure against your chest, not just a sound in your ears. Sweat soaked through your shirt an hour ago and you stopped noticing. Behind you, a crane motor whines, carrying a ladle of iron bright enough to throw your shadow onto the wall in front of you. You've worked this exact station 400 times. You know, without looking down, exactly how far 4 feet is. That's the job on an ordinary night, for anyone who has ever poured iron for a living. Right up until the night the ordinary thing doesn't hold. On Halloween of 2023, a duct fire broke out across all 3 levels of the foundry. One employee, who asked to remain anonymous when she spoke to a local news crew, said there were no sirens and no warnings. Nothing to tell workers on the floor anything was wrong until the smoke was already visible. She said the incident left her afraid to do her job there. That fire broke out 7 months before Simmers died in a different fire in the same building. This is the part of the story that never appears on the corporate tour. The machine displayed in the visitors center is retired, roped off, and entirely safe to stand beside. The one still running is not on the tour, and the people beside it are not roped off from anything. None of this is new to this company, even if the specific building is. Go back far enough, to the plant's earliest decades, before OSHA existed, before a union contract carried anything close to today's weight. And the record of daily danger gets thinner, not because the danger was smaller, but because almost nobody was writing it down. A skilled foundryman in 1925 worked a floor with less mechanization, more open flame, and no federal agency with authority to walk in and inspect it. What survives from that era survives mostly by accident. A photograph, a company newsletter, a lawsuit that happened to leave paperwork behind. The silence in the record for that period isn't proof that nothing happened. In an industry this dangerous, silence of that kind carries its own weight. And this film is going to ask you to hold that thought until the next chapter, when the silence gets a name. Which brings the story back to the 39-year-old on his 9th day. By June of 2022, Steven Dierkes was a melting specialist, one of the workers whose job puts him closest to the pot, sampling and checking the very iron this film has been describing since its opening minute. By every account colleagues gave afterward, he had the kind of quiet competence that makes a foreman comfortable putting a new hire near the most dangerous station on the floor. That comfort is its own kind of risk in a business built on liquid metal. There's no fixed, industry-wide minimum number of days before a new hire is considered ready to work independently near an open pour. That threshold is set plant by plant, sometimes station by station. Some foundries take months. 9 days is not long enough to learn every habit that station can kill you for missing. It was long enough. What happened to him on June the 2nd is next. So is the number this company was willing to pay for it. And a parallel from nearly a century earlier that this company almost certainly never intended anyone to draw. The day the floor disappeared, and the days it happened again. Start with what happened to Scott Adams, 7 months before anyone outside Peoria had heard of Steven Dierkes. Adams was 50 years old, an electrician with 27 years in the trade, working that December for a contractor on a project inside the Mapleton foundry. On December 23, 2021, he stepped off a ladder onto what should have been solid flooring. It wasn't. He fell more than 20 feet through an open hole in the floor and died of his injuries. Federal investigators later found that workers on that project hadn't been protected from exactly the kind of fall that killed him, and 2 contracting firms were cited and fined a combined $10,151. Caterpillar itself, which owned the building and the unguarded hole in its floor, was not the company fined for that one. 6 months later, Steven Dierkes clocked in for his 9th day of work. Here's exactly what the record shows happened next, because it's worth walking through step by step. June 2nd, 2022, a Thursday. The Mapleton foundry was running its normal daytime shift, the kind of unremarkable morning that never makes the news on its own. Dierkes' job that day was melting specialist, which meant pulling a sample from one of the plant's open iron pots to check its chemistry before the batch moved on to be poured into molds. It was routine work, performed multiple times a shift, at a station investigators would later find sat within 4 feet of an 11-foot deep, unguarded drop into more than 2,000 degrees of liquid iron. No rail, no harness, no restraint system of any kind, at a spot the company required workers to occupy regularly. Sometime before 10 that morning, he went in. Peoria County Sheriff's deputies were called to the foundry just before 10 o'clock for what the department's report called an occupational accident. When the coroner arrived, there was no rescue to organize. Dierkes died instantly, the coroner said. The fall itself, and what waited at the bottom of it, leaving nothing for responders to do but confirm what had already happened. No foul play was suspected. There was nothing criminal about it, in the narrow legal sense that word gets used. There was only a 4-foot gap between a walking surface and an open pot of molten iron, on a shift like every other shift, on a man's 9th day of work. The obituary his family published a few days later didn't dwell on the how. It described someone who loved the outdoors and any animal that crossed his path, who could find something to laugh about in almost any room, and whose hands, after years in manufacturing, were rougher than his temperament ever was. Federal investigators spent 5 months finding out why it happened. Investigators traced the cause to a single missing safeguard, a legally required guardrail and travel restraint system that had never been installed around a hazard the company had operated for years. OSHA's citation used a specific legal term for that absence. Not carelessness, not an oversight. A willful violation. Federal regulators sort safety violations into tiers. A serious violation means the company should have known about a hazard capable of causing real harm. A willful violation, the tier applied here, means the evidence showed the company actually knew and chose not to act. It's the most severe finding OSHA can make short of referring a case for criminal prosecution. In federal safety law, that distinction means the agency believes a company knew about a danger and chose, deliberately, not to fix it. The proposed fine for that willful violation, $145,027. Now put that number in context, because context is the entire point of a number like this. In a recent year, Caterpillar's gross profit ran north of $24 billion, which works out to roughly $770 of profit every second, day and night, all year round. At that rate, the entire fine for a man's death took the company about 3 minutes to earn back. Caterpillar contested it in court anyway, and the dispute dragged on for years. 2 years after Dierkes, on the afternoon of June 6, 2024, 28-year-old Daulton Simmers was doing another piece of routine foundry work, transferring molten metal out of a large furnace and into a smaller pot, a transfer performed on nearly every shift at foundries like this one across the country. The sheriff later described what went wrong in plain terms. The metal spilled out of its intended path and engulfed Simmers in fire and molten metal where he stood. Deputies were called to the plant around 5 that afternoon to respond to reports of a fire with a possible fatality. They arrived to find the blaze still burning and Simmers already dead. A preliminary autopsy the next day found he'd suffered severe thermal burns across his body and had very likely died within seconds. Fast enough that there was no interval in which anything could have been done for him. He left behind a fiancé and children. She said afterward that she and the kids were heartbroken, lost for words, and that he had meant everything to them. Look at the 3 Mapleton deaths side by side, and a pattern shows through the differences in exactly how each man died. Adams fell through an unguarded opening in a floor. Dierkes fell past an unguarded edge into a pit. Simmers was caught by molten metal moving through an unshielded transfer point. 3 different mechanisms, 1 identical root condition, an edge, a gap, or a transfer point that needed a physical barrier and didn't have one. None of these are exotic engineering problems. Guardrails, restraint systems, and enclosed transfer equipment are decades old, unglamorous, comparatively inexpensive safety technology, standard practice across plenty of other heavy industries. The same plant produced the same category of death 3 times, not because the danger was unpredictable, but because, each time, the fix apparently wasn't installed until after someone had already fallen. 2 months after Simmers died, 36-year-old Justin Perry, a subcontractor working at a separate Caterpillar facility 15 miles away, was found pinned beneath an electrical control box. The county coroner's office listed the cause as compressional asphyxia, trapped in a position where his own body weight and the weight above him made it impossible to draw breath. Here's what that phrase actually means. Compressional asphyxia happens when weight on the chest or abdomen physically prevents the diaphragm from expanding. A person can have a completely clear airway and still be unable to draw a single breath because their own ribcage can't move against the load. It's the same mechanism that makes building collapses and crowd crushes so lethal, and it means Perry's death, unlike the others in this story, had nothing to do with heat or an open pore. It was pure physical entrapment at a facility built for testing heavy equipment rather than casting it. It was the second Caterpillar-related safety investigation federal regulators had opened that same year. Here's the parallel this film has been holding since its opening minute. 90 years before Steven Dierkes fell into that crucible, in the diversion tunnels of a dam this company's own tractors would later help build, dozens of workers came out of the ground sick, gasping, and gray in the face. The tunnels were thick with exhaust from gasoline-powered haulers, combustion engines running in an enclosed space, filling the air with carbon monoxide that Nevada had already made illegal underground. The contractor running the job used the machines anyway, arguing federal jurisdiction overrode the state ban. 42 of the men who died during that project were recorded, officially, as pneumonia deaths. Not one was ever listed as dying from gas exposure. No civilian in the town built to house the workforce died of pneumonia during the entire construction period. A disease that, if it were real in these numbers, would not have confined itself so neatly to the men working underground around combustion engines. The workers alleged the diagnosis was convenient, a classification that let the contractor avoid paying compensation for what everyone underground already suspected. This isn't proof that Caterpillar's public relations department, 90 years later, studied that old Nevada scandal and copied its homework. What the parallel actually demonstrates is something almost more uncomfortable. An entire industrial culture, across a full century, keeps reaching for the same instinct when a worker dies on the clock. Soften the noun. Isolate the incident. Let whatever fine follows function as the cost of doing business rather than a reason to change the business. Consider how carefully the language is chosen, even now. OSHA's regional administrator didn't dress up the citation when it came down. He said the missing guardrail meant a life could have been saved, and called that a fact that only adds to this tragedy. Caterpillar's own statement, released the same week, promised only that the company would continue to engage with OSHA to seek an appropriate resolution to its review. One sentence names a life. The other names a process. That gap between the two is exactly where this film has been standing since its opening scene. The Mapleton foundry has not closed. It has not been redesigned from the ground up. As of this writing, it still runs multiple shifts, still pours iron for the engine blocks that go into machines carrying the Caterpillar name. The company points, accurately, to safety investments made after each death. New guarding, revised procedures, added training. Workers who've spoken since Simmers died describe a floor that still, on an ordinary Thursday, asks a person to stand within arm's reach of something that could erase them. What's left standing on the line, and what the company still owes. Steven Dierkes' name sits on a headstone in Peoria now. Daulton Simmers' children will grow up with photographs instead of a father. Scott Adams' 27 years in the electrical trade ended on a Thursday morning nobody could have flagged in advance. Justin Perry drove down from Michigan for subcontract work and never drove home. 4 men, 2 Caterpillar sites outside one Illinois city, in under 3 years. 2025 marked 100 years since the Holt and Best merger. An anniversary the company celebrated with a nationwide centennial tour, specially painted commemorative machines, and events at facilities around the world, Peoria included. Daulton Simmers had been dead less than a year when that tour rolled through. So what does the company they died working for actually look like today? Caterpillar Inc. now employs more than 100,000 people worldwide and generates tens of billions of dollars a year building the excavators, dozers, generators, and mining trucks that dig, grade, and pour the infrastructure of the modern world. Its equipment worked the Hoover Dam. It worked the approach roads to the Golden Gate Bridge. It has worked, in one machine or another, on every inhabited continent, in war and peacetime, for longer than almost any industrial company in America. That accomplishment isn't in dispute, and it shouldn't be. The tractors that towed guns out of French mud and cut roads through jungle nobody else could reach were real machines, doing real, difficult, historically important work. The same company also fought, in court, a fine smaller than 3 minutes of its own gross profit. A fine attached to a citation that used the words willful violation to explain why a 39-year-old man died on his 9th day. For a second point of comparison, the same year OSHA proposed that fine, Caterpillar's own chief executive received a total compensation package of roughly $25.8 million, nearly 180 times the size of the largest fine his company was contesting in court. So return to the question this film opened with. A company worth tens of billions, run by people who understand exactly what molten iron does to a human body. Why does it still let workers stand 4 feet from the drop? Here is the honest answer, and it isn't a mystery or a secret document waiting to be uncovered. It's simpler than that, and worse. The 4 feet has never cost the company anything it couldn't absorb. Not in 1925, when a debt-heavy tractor maker merged its way out of trouble and kept every one of its foundries running through the transition. Not in 1931, when the diversion tunnels of a dam its own machines would help build filled with gas that got written down as pneumonia. Not in 2022, when a citation with real legal teeth turned into years of litigation and a number smaller than a rounding error on the annual report. Nobody had to sign a memo ordering it this way. The fire has simply never cost enough, in any given quarter, to be worth putting out properly. Caterpillar will tell you, accurately, that it has made changes after each of these deaths. New guardrails at Mapleton, revised lockout procedures, additional safety staff, promises to keep engaging with regulators. Those changes are real, and they matter to the people working that floor tomorrow morning. They are also, every one of them, changes that arrived after a body, not before one. 100 years of engineering brilliance solved the metallurgy, solved the horsepower, solved the logistics of shipping a 9-ton machine to 6 continents. The industry that pours molten iron has had exactly as long to solve the 4 feet, and foundry by foundry, company by company. It largely hasn't, because the fix has never once been the most profitable line item in the quarter it was proposed. This is the factory that built the Caterpillars, the tractors, the dozers, the machines that moved mountains, raised a dam, and helped win 2 wars. It has never, across more than 100 years, stopped burning its own workers alive to build them. The fire in Mapleton is still burning tonight. It will be burning tomorrow morning, when the next shift clocks in, laces up, and walks the same 4 feet toward the same open pot. A distance the company has been asking men to stand at since long before that particular building existed, in a business it has run, one name or another, for more than 100 years. They don't build tractors like the 60 anymore. They still build the fire the same way.